Hello everyone and welcome to this Total Education lecture. We'd like to remind you that these lectures are brought to you for free, so if you'd like to help us out, give us a like down below. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the space below. And of course, don't forget to visit our website, totaleducationcentre.com.au. At the website you'll find teacher resources if you're a teacher, and of course there are student notes that go along with these lectures that will help and assist you in any examination situation. So don't forget, visit the website totaleducationcentre.com.au. Hello everyone and welcome to this lecture. Today we're looking at Metropolis in 1984, and particularly we're looking at student questions. And these questions have come from students who are having difficulty with certain areas of the study of these two texts, and we're going to try and help you and answer those questions today. A lot of the questions that came through were about context, so I'm going to read you the three questions and I'll try and answer them all simultaneously, so to speak. The first question was, how much contextual information should we use in our essays, especially regarding the messages of both texts? Another question was, what aspects of the Weimar Republic should we use in our analysis of Metropolis? And finally, do we specifically mention context in our essays? And if the answer is yes, how much? Well, to answer those questions, the obvious answer is yes, we're going to talk about context. Because if we look at the rubric from the Board of Studies, the board specifically mentions context. And I'll read you one section of that now. The board asks us in this module to compare texts in order to explore them in relation to their contexts. It develops students' understanding of the effects of context and the questions of value. And I think that's the key to the question. So we are looking at context, and the answer briefly, of course, is yes, we must look at context, but how much? Now it's very important to go back to the rubric again, and if we look at the first section of looking at these intertextual perspectives, it says, in this elective, students compare the content and perspectives in a pair of texts in order to develop their understanding of context, purpose, and audience on the shape of meaning. So there are three specific things that we're looking at there. It says context, purpose, and audience. Now when we talk about context, everyone wants to know, how much do we write about? Well, that again depends on the question, but specifically it shouldn't be most of your essay. There are other things to look at too. Even if it says compare the context and have a look at those contexts, you still need to focus on the other things. So for example, if we're talking about the Weimar Republic, and I know many of you are doing modern history and the Weimar Republic's a really big topic, we do not want a history lesson. If you write 3 pages on the Weimar Republic, you're not getting paid for that. You need to look very specifically at what you are saying and how that affects the representation in the text. There's no point giving a history lesson. You talk briefly, say, for example, if we look at the question there, about the Weimar Republic, but we certainly wouldn't focus on everything that happened in the Weimar Republic, only things that are very specifically directed to Metropolis and the making of Metropolis. So for example, the differentiation in the Weimar Republic between the rich and the poor, and how society grew a little bit apart. And we can see that obviously in Metropolis. So they're the sort of connections that you need and should be making. So I hope that's helped answer those questions briefly. The next question we're looking at today says, can you please discuss the constant warfare in 1984 and why it is used? Orwell keeps Oceania and Eurasia and the other countries in a constant state of warfare to ensure that the political party of the time can keep complete control. Warfare is just another excuse to maintain very, very specific control over the people and over the country. We talked previously, and I'm sure you've talked in class, about how they try and take away individuality, and war does that. It also gives your population someone else to hate. Their focus isn't necessarily on government and how they're being controlled, but it's certainly on the opposition and the warfare. That goes hand in hand with the hatred and the hate scenes that we see in 1984, and the 2 minutes of hate against Goldstein and those sorts of enemies. And that leads us on to our next question really, which is, for an example of a modern day O'Brien, could we use Hitler and Stalin and those sorts of characters and the way they purified them? And in other words, does the party use Goldstein in the way that Stalin and Hitler did and go back to those contextual questions? And the answer is yes, but Remember, in answering our first question, we said let's not look at the detail of the history so much as drawing those parallels. So you might want to mention that, and that probably would have been some of the contextuality that Orwell used when he wrote 1984, in the fact that yes, purges did occur, yes, people were wiped out from history. So for example, Lenin, once he took power and broke away from Trotsky, or Trotsky broke away from him, Trotsky was completely wiped out of all official photos. He was completely wiped out of all historical records of communist Russia, and therefore Orwell may well have got his contextual information and ideas from that. So you need to think very carefully about those sorts of issues and how you use them. There are parallels, of course, in Metropolis, as we talked about previously, between the rich and the poor, and the way the power and authority is used in that. And of course, that's the theme that you'll probably focus most on, is that concept of power in both texts, and draw your parallels between those. But that's another lecture for another time. What aspects of mise-en-scene would best portray the impact of power and or lack thereof in Metropolis? Well, that's an excellent question, and we talk about mise-en-scene, we're talking about the whole scene and how the scene looks and appears on screen. So for example, in Metropolis, if we're looking at power, we can look at Fredison and his office. Notice there all the electronic gadgets that seem so important, and the height of the doors and the vastness of the room. All those imply how powerful he is. We look at the characters, his little assistants in the background, sweating and working away, waiting on every word he says. All those sorts of things combine to make sure that we get the impression that Fredison is a powerful character. If you want to go deeper into that sort of thing, you can look at the clocks on the wall and the timing and how people respond to what he does and how he says. And also look at the use of his hand, as I'm doing now. It's his right hand though, and how his hand sweeps around and just directs things. Like he's the orchestrator, he's the powerful figure. In contrast, if we go down to the depths and we look at how the plebs are portrayed and the people at work in the factories and with the machines down there, they're downtrodden, they're dark. We can look at the contrast between light and dark in that situation, and the use of shadow, that's very important. And we can look at how they're portrayed. They don't walk upright, they walk stooped. They sort of skulk around. They're always perpetually busy at the command of the machine. They have no control over their own lives, and that's exhibited in what they do. And also they don't speak very much. Another feature that you could talk about would be Machine Maria, the robotic Maria, when she's up on stage, and how she's everybody's focus, and she's up much higher than everybody else, and all the men are looking up at her and their eyes are focused on her. And notice the camera angles that Lang uses there to portray very specifically what she does in their eyes and how they respond to her. And that shows the power and control she has over them, through them lusting basically after her, and that famous dance she does on stage that drives them insane. And I'd just like to point out there was a question here, and I don't think this is a serious one. It says, if we could pay you $50, would you perform Hall Maria's dance perfectly for us? Now, for $50, I'm not going to do that. You'd need a fair bit more than that. So I think we'll leave that question there. But just remember, power is extremely important in comparing those two texts, and power and lack of power. And we can also see that in 1984. The power is with the party, and always Orwell's writing is constantly focusing on who has the power, who doesn't have the power. And even Winston's fleeting moments of power and sexuality are not real. They're taken away from him very quickly, and you need to look at the power and the focus in those ideas too. A final question that we need to answer is techniques and quotes. There's a couple of questions here about techniques and quotes, and when we should use techniques and when we should use quotes. And I'm going to say this about quotes. The shorter the quotes and the more of them, the better off you'll be. You've got two texts to write about and only a limited amount of time, so great long quotes won't help you. The quotes that you need to talk about should also be attached to some form of technique. Now, in the previous question I answered, we talked about mise-en-scene and the camera techniques. Now, we know that we should, when we talk about Metropolis, talk about cinematic techniques or film techniques. It's very important that you allow the marker to know that you know it's a film. Likewise, 1984 is a fiction, so you need to talk about the techniques specific techniques that Orwell uses to convince his readers. All that persuasive stuff and the language that he creates with newspeak and all those sorts of special dystopian features that he creates to make the world like it is. I think that's very important that you concentrate in your essay on when you give, you're making a point, you give an example, then you discuss the technique, and then you say the effect of that technique, and that's that last thing that'll get you into the A range. It's very important that you talk about the effect of those techniques on the audience, because that's what's going to get you the marks, and that's what they're looking for in those answers, that relationship between the meaning and the audience. So remember that's particularly important. For all the specific details and specific techniques, you can look at the student notes on this topic, or you can go to the teacher resource unit, download that, and that will help you, give you very, very specific notes and annotations. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I hope we answered those questions. If you have any more questions on this topic, don't forget you can contact us through the channel. Thank you. I'm Bruce Pattinson for Total Education Centre. Goodbye.